On the 1st of November this year, South Africa welcomed the introduction of the DebiCheck payment system to tighten measures against debit order fraud and abuse. Early debit orders are collected shortly after midnight on the debit order collection date. Now, these new and renegotiated early debit orders will need to be verified using DebiCheck or fall into the EFT Debit category. For more on this new system, we're joined by CEO of PAYM8, Andrew Springate. Mr. Springate, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Simpiri.
Now, the 1st of November, DebiCheck was introduced. Why is this, though?
Simpiri, interestingly enough, it became mandatory on the 1st of November. The first DebiCheck transaction actually took place in 2018. Came about primarily because of the fraudulent transactions being hit against debtors' accounts, and also because of the cash management being done by the debtor, reversing and disputing those transactions.
What does it mean for the customer, and what does it mean for the company collecting debit orders?
Okay, Simpiri, long has the customer been prejudiced in these in debits or illegal debits being happening against their accounts. Now, before that takes place, there will be a pre-authorization before any debit can take place against a customer's account.
So does DebiCheck reverse any unauthorized payments or debit orders?
Does DebiCheck reverse them?
What's the role of DebiCheck then in this particular instance?
Yeah, so in this instance, without a pre-authorization by the account holder, a debit cannot be debited against your account.
Okay, so what happens then if a company collecting debit orders is not compliant with DebiCheck as yet?
All right, so if you're not compliant, basically two things happen. Essentially, you're going to get bumped to the back of the queue because you no longer have access to collecting your money in the early window. And you open yourself up to disputes being happening against the amounts that you've collected.
So how do they become compliant?
Very simply. Essentially, you have to register with your bank. You go through a process which we as a company like PAYM8 can take you through. Once you've pre-approved and you pass the credit criteria, you can apply to become DebiCheck enabled, and you can then process your debit orders via the DebiCheck system.
So will DebiCheck then stop companies debiting customers' accounts when they feel like it?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, without a pre-authorization, no debit will be able to be run in the DebiCheck stream against your account.
So where can consumers get more information on DebiCheck?
Essentially, there's a website, the DebiCheck website. Alternatively, you can get hold of our business, which is PAYM8, www.paym8.co.za, and we can fill those customers in terms of the DebiCheck detail.
So is it secure enough, not to be intercepted by hackers?
How long is a piece of string? One never knows whether or not in the technical world everything is secure. But essentially, before the debit takes place on your account, the bank checks against the database, checks to see whether or not the account holder has pre-approved the debit, and then only then will allow the debit to run against your account. So for all intents and purposes, it's a heck of a lot safer than what it was.
So how long does the whole process take? I mean, for DebiCheck to start checking the authenticity of this particular payment or a debit order or the authorization thereof?
Okay, so the process is a lot more cumbersome for the merchant because the merchant has to collect detail like the amount, the date of the debit, the duration of the contract, the account to be debited, etc. That then has got to be sent to the bank. The bank then gets hold of the account holder and gets the account holder to pre-authorize that. Once the account holder has pre-authorized it, it goes into a database, and on the date of the debit, when the debit will take place, the bank checks that before it runs the debit order. So from a timing point of view, all the work it happens up front. Thereafter, it becomes a simple process.
So if DebiCheck knows that the 25th, for instance, is a debit date, and then it so happens that a debit, happens a day earlier or a day after, and in particular in December, some debit orders go off on the 15th. So does DebiCheck have that, authority to reverse or just allow some of the debit orders to go off?
Yes, it does. So what happens is pre-approved by the debtor. So in the rules of DebiCheck, if your debit day, for example, falls on a public holiday or on a Sunday, the rules of DebiCheck allow the transaction to be moved forward a day, and the customer is advised accordingly.
All right, Mr. Springate, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us an update on this.
Thanks, Mpiri. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you. We just spoke to the CEO of PAYM8, Andrew Springate, on DebiCheck, which was introduced to avoid the inevitable headaches that always come with having to deal with early unauthorized debit orders.